Well, good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of our continuing comparative religions classes. This one's a little bit different. We're usually gathered together in the auditorium here at Rottle Park for these fun sessions. With our current situation of quarantine and social isolation, I come to you live over the internet. So let's see if we can get through this. This will be an interesting one for us and an appropriate one because today I will be talking about the story of the Exodus and the significance that the Exodus has for Passover, for both the Jewish community and for the community of Christians as well. I'm going to start off by sharing with you a word. The word is myth. Actually, it comes from the Greek word mythos, which simply means a story. Any traditional story consisting of events that are presumably historical, though often supernatural, is the way we understand myth. Every culture has its own mythology, the stories that explain the origins of cultural practices or natural phenomena. Myth can be a sacred story, a traditional narrative. It could be a story of the tale of the gods. Myth can be a story that explains to us why or how something happens. But myth is not a falsehood. Myth is a reality. It's a sacred reality, a sacred narrative, because it holds religious and spiritual significance. It tells a story. In this case, the story of God and a story of God's people. The book of Exodus is the story of God rescuing the people of Israel from Egypt and claiming them as his people. Exodus is the second book of the Bible, the second book of the Torah, and it's in the Torah that we find these stories of 10 plagues, the first Passover, the parting of the Red Sea, the 10 Commandments, and so many other stories of life and value, of tradition and meaning. Exodus is a story that picks up where the book of Genesis leaves off. The young nation of Israel is in Egypt. They went down there because of famine. They went there because God's leading brought them there. The story of Joseph and his brothers and jealousy as the people end up in Egypt. Joseph goes down there as a slave and rises to prominence and is able to save many people because of the coming famine, and his understanding and wisdom allowed him to do so. And it was his brothers who came to him for help. They didn't know who he was at first, but he revealed himself to them. And eventually they get the father, Jacob, to come down with them. And this small group of what we are told 70 people settles in the land of Egypt. And over time, they begin to grow and begin to prosper. And then a new Pharaoh arises, one who does not know who Joseph is, one who does not know this history, one who does not recognize and sees these Israelites becoming more numerous, becoming, in his eyes, a threat and a danger, and he begins to enslave them. During this process, he is afraid of an uprising, and he gives out the order that all newborn Jewish males should be put to death. They should be cast into the Nile and done away with. But one son escapes. His name is Moses. His mother, Jochebed, secretly hid him when Pharaoh ordered all of these newborn Hebrew boys to be killed. And she was able to spare his life and to set him in a basket and put him out in the river, hopefully that his life would be spared. The irony of the story, of course, is that Pharaoh's daughter is the one who discovers this infant child, Moses, takes him into the house, raises him as her own child, adopted, and grows up in the household of the Egyptian royal family. Moses, the one who is drawn out of the water. When Moses grows older, we are told the story in the book of Exodus that he was out one day from the royal palace. He had been brought up there and raised as an Egyptian prince, and he was out looking over what was happening, and he was seeing the affliction of the Hebrew people, his brothers, his sisters, being, persecuted and being beaten and being terrorized by the Egyptian taskmasters. It was in that situation that Moses becomes very enraged. The treatment of the laborers in Europe certainly was very cruel in this time of bondage. There's a wall painting from the 15th century of a tomb, and in the tomb there is a picture of a farm overseer beating a slave while another slave begs for mercy. According to the book of Moses, it was this type of treatment, this type of cruelty, that caused Moses to strike out at one of the Egyptian overlords and to kill him. And as a result, Moses had to run for his life. He runs away as fast as he can, and he comes out to find himself in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula to an area known as Midian. And there, Moses gets lucky. He ends up serving as a shepherd to a man who was the priest of Midian, a man by the name of Jethro. And after meeting Moses, Jethro gives him a big promotion. Moses is able to marry Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, and find safety and security. So I guess that old adage is correct. If you want to succeed in life, the best thing to do is to marry the boss's daughter. Well, it is while Moses is staying in Midian that God appears to him in a very unique and surprising way. Moses is out tending to his father-in-law's sheep, and as he is going through the one day, he comes upon this bush that is burning. But it is not being consumed. And Moses turns aside to go over to see what this might mean. And it was there that he encounters the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, and is introduced to this God and is introduced to a very new and special calling. It was there that Moses was told that he was standing on holy ground and that he was to remove his shoes. And it was there that God spoke to him and called him to go to Pharaoh and to demand that the people be released from bondage. Moses' reaction, I think, is a reaction that many of us could understand. His first expression simply was, "Who am I to go to Pharaoh?" But wait a minute. Moses grew up in the household of Pharaoh. He grew up as the child that became royalty in that household. He would have been known very well. Who am I to go? Eventually, God said to Moses that he would lead the people out of Egypt and into the land of promise. And Moses tried again and again to get out of this job of confronting Pharaoh and made many, many excuses. But eventually God sends Moses with his brother Aaron to go and meet with Pharaoh. Moses does return to Egypt. He does confront Pharaoh, and yet fails to convince Pharaoh to let the people go. Well, maybe Moses was not aware of this. Maybe he was. But God made Moses' job a little bit more difficult than it had to be. See, the text tells us that God hardened the heart of Pharaoh. so that Pharaoh would get to see the power of God. Despite numerous warnings from Moses, Pharaoh refused to heed God's command to let the people of the Hebrews go free. And then, as we continue in the story, God sends upon Egypt 10 very devastating plagues, afflicting them and destroying everything from their crops to their livestock to everything. 10 plagues, one right after the other. It begins with the waters of the Nile and the waters of all of Egypt turning to blood. And after this, swarms of frogs begin to cover the land. Gnats come next. Swarms of fly come next. The Egyptian cattle begin to die. Boils break out on the skins of the Egyptians. Hail and fire rain down. Locusts consume their crops. And darkness covers the entire face of the world. And throughout all of these, Pharaoh's heart continued to be hardened, and he would not listen to Moses, nor would he obey the command of God to let the people go. The final plague was the death of the firstborn of Egypt. According to the text in Exodus, and according to the tradition, at the stroke of midnight, on the 15th of Nisan, in the year 2448 from creation, God visited the last of the 10 plagues upon the Egyptians. The Israelites were instructed to mark the doorposts of their home with the blood of a slaughtered spring lamb. And upon seeing this, the Spirit of the Lord knew to pass over the firstborn in these homes. In Hebrew, this celebration is known as Pesach, which means to pass over. When Pharaoh freed the Israelites, it is said that they left in such a hurry that they could not wait for bread dough to rise. And so in commemoration, in the celebration of Pesach, no leavened bread is eaten. Thus matzah, flat unleavened bread, is eaten during the Passover and is the tradition of the holiday. Passover is important biblically because it is a Jewish holiday. The Jewish people celebrate Passover as the commemoration of their liberation by God from their slavery in Egypt and their freedom as a nation under the leadership of Moses. And the book of Exodus in chapter 12, as it tells his story, tells the people that this day shall be a day of remembrance for you, and you shall keep it. Passover lasts for 7 days, or 8 days outside of Israel. The first and the last days of the holidays are the days on which no work is permitted, but work is permitted on the intermediate days. The biblical regulations for the observance of the festival require that all leavening be disposed of before the beginning of the holiday. And so it's a time to clean house, to get things ready and to be prepared. An unblemished lamb or goat, known as the Paschal lamb, is to be set apart. It is to be slaughtered at dusk on Nisan 14, and it ends in the preparation for the 15th of Nisan, when it will be eaten after being roasted. So a couple of key terms: Pesach, or Passover; matzah, unleavened bread; chametz, leavened things; the Seder, or order. These are the rituals that are performed during the nights of Passover; and the Haggadah, the story that is read during the Passover Seder. It's a tradition that the Jewish people have kept throughout all the generations, a way of remembering the mighty acts of God, of God's acts of redeeming Israel from bondage in slavery in Egypt and bringing them out, as the text says, with an outstretched arm and a mighty hand. It's a story of faith, a story of religious tradition, a story of God's working in our midst. And we come to the celebration once again this week of the Passover. It's sad that we are not able to have our usual Passover Seders here this year because of the ongoing crisis with the coronavirus and the fears of COVID-19. But we still, as a community, can gather together and remember and to celebrate. Some of you may be able to have a virtual Seder by joining together with family and friends through our marvelous technology of programs like Zoom or Skype. And if that is the case, enjoy and celebrate and rejoice as you tell the story again of God's wonderful acts. In the Christian tradition, we haven't really kept up as well with this understanding, but Passover plays a significant event in the history of Christianity. According to the biblical texts in the gospel stories of Matthew, Mark, Luke, what we call the Last Supper was actually a celebration of the Passover feast. Jesus and his disciples, according to the gospel stories, celebrate the Passover just prior to his arrest and his trial, his crucifixion. It was during the celebration of Passover that Jesus gave a new interpretation that has become central to the life of the Christian community. It was the interpretation of the bread and wine that was a part of the Passover meal. Cup of wine and the bread became common elements as a sign and a symbol of a new redemption act that God was doing. The Christian community, from the earliest days, recognized that the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus was symbolic of the Paschal Lamb, the sacrifice made to God for the redemption of the people. Well, in the observance of Passover, what happens simply is this. Whether as members of the people of Israel or members of the Christian tradition, the observance of Passover, the events of this story, commemorate what is arguably the most important event of all human history, the Exodus. If for no other reason than the fact that the Exodus directly or indirectly generated many of the most important events cited by other groups. This is the event of human history. The Exodus transformed the Jewish people and their ethic. The Ten Commandments, as a part of this story, open up with the words, "I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage." And therefore, there are 10 commandments because of the God who brought us out. You shall have no other gods before me, was that first commandment. It means giving no absolute status to any other form of divinity or any other human value that demands absolute commitment. Neither money nor power, neither economic nor political system has the right to claim absolute loyalty over our lives. Our God has told us, "I am the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Therefore, you shall have no other gods before me." Exodus morality meant recognizing God's special care for, special attention for, special concern for giving justice to those who are weak and those who are poor. The admonition throughout the Torah, throughout the prophetic literature, is a reminder of the special needs of the widow, the orphan, and the sojourner in the midst. There were calls for people to be dealing with honest weights and measures, to be giving interest-free loans to the poor, to leave parts of your crops out in the field for the sojourner, for providing care for the orphans and widows who are most vulnerable, for treating those who are alien strangers in your midst as if they were native citizens. These are all applications of the Exodus principle to living in this world. The secret of the impact of the Exodus is that it does not present itself as an ancient history, as a one-time event. The key to remembering the Exodus reenactment is this: the celebration of Passover is an event that offers itself as an ongoing experience in our human history. In other words, when we come to the celebration of Passover, we put ourselves in the story. As free people relive the Exodus, it turns our memories into a moral dynamic. The experience of slavery that breaks and crushes the slave does not destroy free people. It evokes feelings of repulsion and determination to help others escape that state. The story of the Exodus, the story of the Passover, is a story of God acting for justice, for righteousness, for love in the lives of people even to this day. And so this week, as we celebrate Passover, and we remember to tell the story again, we remember that we are a part of it. May it be a time of blessing, a time of good memory, a time of grace, a time of thriving. In spite of the world as it is today, we still are people who have been freed by the power of God. Amen.